The foreclosure notice had been taped to the front door for 11 days. 11 days of watching the paper curl at the edges, dampened by morning dew and dried again by afternoon heat. The ink bleeding slightly, but still legible enough to remind her every time she turned the key. Tomorrow, it would be official. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, the house that had sheltered 3 generations of her family would belong to the county, and she and her 2 daughters would belong to nowhere at all. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Rachel Calloway stood in the narrow hallway of the house on Birch Lane, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes fixed on the water stain spreading across the ceiling above the bathroom door. The stain had been there for months, growing slowly, a darkening in the center like a bruise that refused to heal. She had called 3 contractors when it first appeared. Each one had given her a number that made the breath leave her body. The cheapest estimate was $4,000. She had $47 in her checking account and a jar of coins on the kitchen counter that her youngest daughter, Lily, liked to count on rainy afternoons. The last time Lily counted, the total had been $11.32. The house was dying around her, and she could not afford to save it. The roof leaked. The furnace groaned through winter like an animal in pain. The porch steps had rotted through on the left side, and she had placed a piece of plywood over the gap with a hand-painted sign that read, "Watch your step," as if a warning could substitute for repair. The kitchen faucet dripped at a rhythm she had memorized, a slow and persistent pulse that measured the hours she lay awake at night, calculating numbers that never added up. She had inherited the house from her grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, a woman who had lived in it for 51 years, and who had died in the back bedroom with the curtains drawn and the radio playing softly, as though she had simply chosen to leave one room for another. The inheritance had not come with money. It had come with a house that needed everything and a property tax bill that arrived with the regularity of seasons. Eleanor had left no savings, no investments, no insurance policy tucked into a drawer. She had left walls and a roof and a yard that backed up against a line of oak trees, whose roots had long ago cracked the foundation on the east side. Rachel had moved in because she had no other option. Her marriage had ended 2 years before her grandmother's death, dissolved not by a single dramatic event, but by a slow erosion of trust and patience that left nothing behind except 2 daughters and a custody agreement that favored her only because her ex-husband hadn't fought for more. David had moved to another state, sent support checks that arrived late and incomplete, and eventually stopped sending them altogether. The court orders piled up in a folder she kept in the kitchen drawer, next to the takeout menus and the expired coupons. Each one represented a promise, broken so many times it had lost the power to disappoint her. She worked 2 jobs. During the day, she cleaned houses for a service that paid her $12 an hour and deducted fees for supplies she was required to purchase through the company. In the evenings, 3 nights a week, she stocked shelves at a grocery store where the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that settled into her skull and stayed there long after she drove home. The math was simple and merciless. Her income covered food, utilities, gas, and the minimum payments on 2 credit cards she had used to replace the water heater and repair the car's transmission. It did not cover property taxes. It did not cover the insurance that had lapsed 6 months ago. And it did not cover the mortgage payment that her grandmother had somehow managed to maintain on a house that should have been paid off decades earlier, but had been refinanced twice during years Rachel knew nothing about. The bank had been patient at first. Letters arrived with language that sounded almost gentle, words like opportunity and resolution and options available. Then the language hardened. Default, delinquency, legal proceedings. The final letter had been delivered by a man who knocked once, waited exactly 5 seconds, and left it wedged between the door and the frame without ever looking her in the eye. Tomorrow, the house would be gone. And tonight, Rachel Calloway was standing in the hallway, staring at the water stain above the bathroom door, not because she was mourning the house, but because she had noticed something she had never seen before. The bathroom mirror was crooked. It was a small thing, barely worth attention under normal circumstances. The mirror had hung on the wall above the sink for as long as Rachel could remember. It was large, rectangular, framed in dark wood that had been painted white at some point, and then painted again in a shade of cream that did not quite match the walls. Her grandmother had hung it there years before Rachel was born. It had always been straight. It had always been flush against the wall. Now, standing in the hallway with the weight of tomorrow pressing against her chest, she noticed that the bottom right corner had pulled away from the wall by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. She almost ignored it. She almost turned away and went to bed, where she would lie awake and listen to the faucet drip and the furnace groan and the silence of a house that would not be hers by noon. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the instinct that comes from living in a house that was always breaking, always demanding attention, always offering new problems, as though testing how much she could bear. Perhaps it was the simple need to do something, anything, other than wait for morning. She stepped into the bathroom and reached for the mirror. The frame was heavier than she expected, anchored to the wall by 2 metal brackets that had been screwed directly into the plaster. She tugged gently at the loose corner, and the mirror shifted, tilting outward with a faint scraping sound that echoed off the tile floor. Behind it, the wall was darker, unexposed to light for years, the plaster smooth and undisturbed, except for the envelope. It was pressed flat against the wall, held in place by the mirror's weight, rather than adhesive or fastener. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, the kind of heavy stationery that people used when letters were written by hand and sealed with intention. There was no name on the front, no address, no stamp, just a single word, written in ink that had faded to a deep brown, the handwriting unmistakable even after years. The word was Rachel. Her hands trembled as she pulled the envelope free. The paper was stiff, resistant to bending, as though it had been pressed against the wall for so long that it had taken the shape of the surface behind it. She turned it over and saw that the flap had been sealed with wax, the impression too worn to identify clearly, but deliberate. Her grandmother had sealed this letter with wax and placed it behind a mirror and never mentioned it. Not once. Not in the years they had spent together in this house. Not in the conversations that stretched across kitchen tables and front porches and hospital rooms in the final weeks. Not a word. Rachel carried the envelope into the kitchen, sat down at the table where the foreclosure papers lay, in a neat stack beside a coffee mug, stained dark around the rim, and opened the letter with a knife from the drawer. The handwriting inside was her grandmother's. She recognized it immediately. The careful loops, the slight forward lean, the way certain letters connected, and others stood apart as though insisting on independence. The ink was the same faded brown. The paper was lined, torn carefully from a notebook, and the words filled both sides of 3 pages. The letter began without greeting. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are in this house, and the house is in trouble. I know, because the house has always been in trouble. I kept it alive as long as I could, but there are things I could not fix, and things I chose not to explain while I was still here to be asked about them. What I am about to tell you, I have never told anyone. Not your mother. Not your grandfather, who died believing he knew everything about me, and was wrong about the one thing that mattered most. Rachel read the first paragraph twice, her heart beating harder with each pass. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 20 minutes past 10. In less than 11 hours, a representative from the county would arrive to begin the process of claiming the property. She turned back to the letter. This house was built in 1923, by a man named Henry Calloway, your great-great-grandfather. You know this. What you don't know is that Henry did not build it alone, and he did not build it only as a home. Henry had a brother named Arthur, and Arthur was not the kind of man whose name appeared in family stories. He was removed from them deliberately, and I was the last person alive who knew why. Arthur Calloway was a jeweler, not the kind who sat behind a counter in a shop and sold rings to nervous young men. He was a craftsman who worked with stones and metals that most people never saw outside of museum cases. He traveled extensively through Europe and South America during the 1920s and 30s. He acquired pieces that were extraordinary, not only in value, but in origin. And some came from estates that had been dissolved after the First War. Others came from collections that had been dispersed during political upheaval in countries whose names have changed since then. Arthur didn't steal, but he operated in the spaces between legitimacy and opportunity, and he accumulated a collection that by the standards of any era would be considered remarkable. Rachel's hands had stopped trembling. They were steady now, gripping the paper with a focus that blocked out the dripping faucet and the hum of the refrigerator and the awareness of time passing. She read on. When Arthur returned to the United States for the last time in 1938, he was afraid. Not of the law, but of the world. He had seen what was coming in Europe before most Americans understood it, and he believed that war would reach further than anyone expected, that economies would collapse, that the things people trusted, banks, governments, currencies, would fail or be seized. He brought his collection home and asked his brother Henry for help hiding it. Henry agreed because Henry loved his brother, and because Henry understood that Arthur's fear was not irrational. They spent 3 months modifying this house. The work was done at night, by hand, without hiring anyone from outside the family. They built a space that was meant to survive not just years, but generations. A space that would remain hidden unless someone knew exactly where to look and exactly what to do to reach it. The letter continued for another page and a half, and with every line, the world Rachel thought she knew shifted beneath her like the foundation of the house itself, cracked and settling into a new position. Eleanor described the location not in architectural terms, but in a sequence of steps, so precise that they read like instructions for a ritual rather than directions to a room. The bathroom. Start in the bathroom. The mirror is not a decoration, it is a marker. Behind it, at the level of your waist, you will find a seam in the plaster that does not match the rest of the wall. Press firmly along this seam until you feel the surface give. The panel will slide inward. Behind it is a second wall, and in that wall is a handle disguised as a pipe fitting. Turn it counterclockwise until it stops. The floor beneath the bathtub will shift. You will need to move the tub. I know this sounds impossible, but it was designed to move. There are rollers beneath it, hidden by the baseboard. Remove the baseboard on the left side, and you will see them. Push the tub toward the window. Beneath it, you will find a hatch secured by a lock. The key is inside the envelope with this letter. Rachel shook the envelope. A small brass key fell onto the table, landing on top of the foreclosure notice with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. She stared at it, her mind racing, disbelief competing with a desperate, fragile hope that she was afraid to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant risking disappointment. And she had been disappointed so many times that hope itself had become something she handled carefully, like a glass already cracked. She picked up the key and closed her fingers around it. The metal was cold and smooth, and worn at the edges from use that must have occurred long before she was born. She returned to the letter. What is beneath this house has been there since 1939. Arthur placed it there with his own hands and sealed the entrance himself. He died in 1944, not in the war, but of pneumonia, alone in a hospital in Baltimore. He never married. He never told anyone else about the collection. The knowledge passed to Henry, who told only his wife, your great-great-grandmother, who told no one. When Henry died, the secret passed to his son, your great-grandfather, who told your grandfather on his deathbed. Your grandfather told me on ours. I chose not to open the space. I chose not to look. I was afraid of what knowing would do to me, to the family, to the peace I had built in this house. I told myself that the collection could wait, that someday someone would need it more than I did, that someday this letter would be found at the right time by the right person. If you are reading this, Rachel, then that person is you. I am sorry I did not tell you face to face. I am sorry I left you a house that leaks and groans and demands more than it gives. But I did not leave you an empty house. I left you everything Arthur brought back from a world that was falling apart, saved for a moment exactly like the one you are in now. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Do not tell anyone until you know what you have. And when you know, be careful. Be wise. Be braver than I was. The letter was signed simply, Eleanor. Rachel sat at the kitchen table for a long time after finishing the letter. The clock ticked. The faucet dripped. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window before disappearing. She read the letter again, then a third time, committing the instructions to memory, testing each sentence against everything she knew about her grandmother, and finding no contradiction, only the familiar shape of a woman who kept her own counsel and measured her words as carefully as she measured flour. The doubt was there, of course. It sat beside the hope like a shadow, whispering that the letter was the fantasy of an old woman whose mind had wandered in her final years, that the space beneath the bathroom was empty or flooded or filled with nothing but dust and disappointment. Eleanor had been sharp until the end, unsharp enough to manage her medications and argue with her doctor and remember the names of every nurse who entered her room. But people told stories. People believed things that were not true. The line between memory and myth could thin without warning, especially across generations. And yet the key was real. The wax seal was real. The handwriting was unmistakable, and the mirror had been crooked, as though something beneath the house had shifted, as though the earthquake that rattled the region 3 weeks ago, the one that cracked the sidewalk on Birch Lane and knocked pictures off walls throughout the neighborhood, had disturbed not only the surface of things, but the hidden layers beneath. She stood and walked back to the bathroom. The mirror still hung at its tilted angle. The gap at the bottom right corner, visible now like a mouth slightly open, ready to speak. She gripped the frame and pulled. The brackets resisted, then gave way with a sound of plaster crumbling. The mirror came free, heavier than she expected, and she set it carefully against the opposite wall. The wall behind it was smooth plaster, painted the same cream as the rest of the bathroom. She ran her fingers across the surface, pressing gently, searching for the seam Eleanor had described. At first there was nothing. Just wall, just plaster. Just the flat, unyielding surface of a house built 100 years ago by hands that understood how to make things last. Then she found it. It was not visible. It was tactile, a line so thin that it could only be detected by fingertips rather than eyes. It ran vertically for about 2 feet, but then turned at a right angle and continued horizontally before turning again. A rectangle, hidden within the wall, its edges sealed with paint and time, but distinct once she knew what to feel for. She pressed along the seam as the letter instructed. The first press produced nothing. The second, harder, met resistance that felt intentional rather than structural. On the third press, something clicked, and the section of wall shifted inward by half an inch. She caught her breath. The sound had been mechanical, not the creak of settling wood or the pop of expanding plaster. It was the sound of a latch releasing, of a mechanism designed to respond to pressure applied in the right place. She pushed the panel further. It slid inward on tracks that were invisible from the outside, and revealing a dark space behind the wall, roughly 18 inches deep. The air that escaped was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of metal and something else. Something old, but not unpleasant, like the smell of a book that had been closed for decades. Inside the cavity, she could see the pipe fitting Eleanor had described. It looked exactly like the other pipes visible in the bathroom, the kind that ran behind walls and connected to fixtures throughout the house. But this one was not connected to anything. It protruded from the back wall of the hidden space, its surface dull but not corroded, and it ended in a valve handle that resembled any other plumbing fixture in the house. The disguise was perfect. Anyone who opened this wall for a repair would see a pipe and think nothing of it. Only someone who knew what it was would think to turn it. Rachel reached in and gripped the handle. It was cold and slightly rough, textured for grip rather than appearance. She turned it counterclockwise, and it moved with surprising ease, as though the mechanism had been engineered to function smoothly even after decades of disuse. 1 full turn. 2. On the third turn, the handle stopped, and something beneath the floor shifted with a low, grinding sound that vibrated through the soles of her bare feet. She stepped back and looked at the bathtub. It was a cast-iron clawfoot tub, original to the house, heavy enough that she had never considered moving it even for cleaning. The thought of pushing it seemed absurd, but Eleanor's letter had been precise about this. Rollers, hidden beneath the baseboard on the left side. Rachel knelt beside the tub and examined the baseboard. It appeared ordinary, painted the same cream as everything else, nailed into place along the bottom of the wall. She worked her fingers beneath the edge and pulled. The baseboard came away more easily than it should have, as though the nails had been shortened deliberately or the wood had been cut to allow removal. Behind it, set into the floor, were 3 small metal wheels, their surfaces dark with age, but their frames intact. Rollers, exactly as described. She positioned herself behind the tub and pushed. The cast iron resisted for a moment, then began to move with a smoothness that defied its weight. The rollers engaged, and the tub slid across the tile floor toward the window, revealing a section of flooring that looked different from the rest. The tiles here were slightly darker, their grout lines deeper, their surface less worn. Beneath the tub, protected from decades of foot traffic and water splashes, the floor had preserved itself in a state closer to its original condition. And in the center of this preserved section was a hatch. It was rectangular, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, its edges defined by metal framing set flush with the tile surface. A brass lock plate was set into one side, its keyhole small and precise. Rachel's hands shook as she retrieved the key from the kitchen table. She knelt beside the hatch, inserted the key, and turned it. The lock released with a click that seemed to echo through the entire house. She lifted the hatch, which swung upward on hinges that moved without sound, and looked down into darkness. The first thing she noticed was the air, and it was different from the air in the hidden wall cavity. This was colder, drier, and carried a mineral quality that reminded her of caves she had visited as a child. The darkness below was total, unbroken by any source of light. She retrieved her phone from the kitchen and activated the flashlight, then directed the beam downward. Stone steps descended into the earth, their surfaces worn but solid, their edges defined by careful masonry. The walls on either side were not dirt or exposed foundation. They were constructed stone, fitted together with the same precision that characterized the house above. This was not a root cellar or a crawl space. This was a deliberate construction, designed with the same care and intention that had gone into every other element of the house that Henry Calloway had built. She descended slowly, to one hand on the cold stone wall, the other holding the phone ahead of her. The steps numbered 12. She counted them without thinking, a habit formed by years of navigating the house in darkness during power outages. At the bottom, the space opened into a room that was larger than she had imagined, roughly the size of the living room above, with a ceiling high enough that she could stand, fully upright without ducking. The room was lined with shelves, not rough wooden planks balanced on brackets, but built-in stone ledges that extended from the walls at regular intervals, creating tiers that rose from floor to ceiling. The shelves were not empty. They held containers of various sizes, wooden boxes with brass fittings, leather cases darkened by age, cloth bundles tied with cord that had stiffened over the decades. Oh, everything was arranged with deliberate spacing, each item placed as though its position had been chosen with care rather than convenience. Rachel stood at the center of the room and turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping across the shelves, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The space was dry. There was no sign of water damage, no mold, no evidence that the elements had penetrated the construction. Whoever had built this room had understood how to protect it from the moisture that plagued the house above. The air quality was remarkable, cool and stable, as though the temperature had been maintained by the earth itself, rather than by any mechanical system. She approached the nearest shelf and examined the first container. It was a wooden box approximately the size of a bread loaf, its surface darkened by age, but its construction intact. The brass clasp that held it shut was green with patina, but functional. She opened it, and the hinges moved with a resistance that suggested disuse rather than damage. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had faded from what must have been deep blue to a muted gray, were stones. She did not know their names at first. She was not a jeweler. She was not a gemologist. She was a woman who cleaned houses and stocked shelves and counted coins in a jar. But she knew, with an instinct that required no expertise, that what she was looking at was not ordinary. The stones caught her flashlight and returned it transformed, fractured into colors that moved and shifted as though the light itself was alive inside them. Reds deeper than any she had seen outside of sunsets, some blues that carried the weight of oceans, greens that seemed to pulse with an internal luminescence that defied the beam of a phone flashlight in an underground room. She set the box down carefully and opened another. This one contained gold. Not coins, not jewelry, but small bars, each roughly the size of her index finger, stamped with markings she could not read. They were heavy, astonishingly heavy for their size, and their surfaces gleamed with a warmth that seemed independent of the cold light she directed at them. She counted 6 in the first box and found 3 more boxes of identical size on the same shelf. The next shelf held leather cases, their clasps more elaborate, their construction suggesting a higher level of craft. Inside the first case, she found a necklace arranged on a form that held its shape despite the years. The chain was gold, its links fine and uniform, and from it hung a pendant set with a stone so large and so brilliantly cut that she stepped back involuntarily, as though the object itself demanded space. The stone was red, deep and clear, and even in the uneven light of her phone, it threw patterns across the walls of the room like a tiny, imprisoned fire. She did not open every container that night. She could not. The scope of what surrounded her overwhelmed the capacity for systematic examination. Instead, she moved through the room in a state that alternated between wonder and disbelief, touching surfaces, lifting lids, glimpsing contents that accumulated into an understanding she was not yet ready to name. There were more stones, loose and mounted, in colors and sizes that suggested origins spanning continents. There were more gold bars, dozens of them, arranged in rows with military precision. There were coins in cases, some ancient, their surfaces worn to a softness that spoke of centuries of handling. There were documents in sealed tubes, their contents unknown but their preservation deliberate. In the far corner of the room, separate from the other shelves, a single wooden chest sat on the floor. It was larger than the boxes, roughly the size of a small trunk, and it was locked with a mechanism more complex than the simple clasps elsewhere. Rachel did not try to open it. She knelt beside it and placed her hand on its surface, feeling the grain of the wood, the coolness of the metal fittings, the weight of whatever lay inside pressing against the structure that contained it. She did not know how long she stayed in the room. Time had lost its authority somewhere between the first step down and the first box opened. When she finally climbed the stone steps back to the bathroom, the house above felt different. The water stain on the ceiling was still there. The faucet still dripped. The foreclosure notice still lay on the kitchen table beneath the brass key. But the house was no longer dying. It was no longer a burden she carried alone. Beneath it, hidden by a brother's love and a family's silence, was something that changed the math entirely. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the foreclosure papers, the numbers printed on them, the amounts owed, the fees accumulated, the deadlines passed, seemed small now, not insignificant. The threat was real. The county would arrive in the morning with legal authority and procedural certainty, but the threat existed in a context that had shifted so dramatically that the papers themselves felt like relics of a problem that was already being solved. She did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen with her grandmother's letter spread before her and tried to calculate what she had seen. She was not qualified to assign values. She had no frame of reference for uncut gemstones the size of walnuts or gold bars stamped with markings from decades past. But she understood enough to know that the contents of that room were not modest. The collection Arthur Calloway had assembled during 20 years of travel through a world in upheaval was not a handful of keepsakes or a sentimental inheritance. It was a fortune. Specific numbers would come later, when experts examined what she had found. But the scale was already clear. So she thought about her grandmother, sitting in this same kitchen, knowing what lay beneath the floor and choosing not to open it. Eleanor had lived modestly, had patched and repaired and economized her way through decades, and all the while, beneath her feet, was a collection worth more than the house, more than the street, more than the entire neighborhood. The choice not to look was not born of ignorance or indifference. It was born of something Rachel was only beginning to understand, a fear that wealth of this kind would change things in ways that could not be controlled, that the knowledge itself was a kind of disturbance, like the earthquake that had shifted the mirror and cracked the sidewalk and set in motion the chain of events that led Rachel to this moment. Eleanor had waited for the right time. She had waited for necessity, and necessity had arrived in the form of a foreclosure notice and a daughter's empty checking account, and 2 granddaughters who deserved more than a plywood patch over a rotting step. The morning came. The sky lightened. The birds began. Rachel heard her daughters stirring in their rooms, the familiar sounds of waking that she cherished because they were proof of the life she had built, imperfect and precarious as it was. She folded the letter, returned it to the envelope, and placed the envelope in the pocket of her robe. Then she made coffee and waited. The county representative arrived at 9:15, a man in a gray suit who carried a clipboard and spoke in a tone that suggested he had delivered this kind of news many times before. He was not unkind. He was efficient, which in this context served the same purpose. He began explaining the process, the timeline, the steps that would follow once the property was officially transferred. Rachel let him speak for exactly 90 seconds before she interrupted. She asked for a delay, not a cancellation, not a reversal, just time. 48 hours. She explained that she had reason to believe the financial situation had changed, that she needed time to consult with professionals, that she was requesting the standard grace period that state law allowed in cases where new circumstances emerged before the final transfer. The man hesitated. He consulted his phone. He made a call that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds, while Rachel stood on the porch and watched her daughters leave for the school bus, and their backpacks too heavy, and their jackets too thin, and their laughter too bright for a morning that was supposed to be the end of something. The delay was granted. 48 hours. It was not much, but it was enough. Rachel spent the first of those 48 hours making 3 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer whose name she found through a legal aid service, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who specialized in property law and who listened to Rachel's carefully edited summary with a patience that suggested she was accustomed to hearing stories that sounded impossible. The second call was to an appraiser recommended by the lawyer, a man who worked with estates and historical collections and who agreed to visit the property that afternoon under conditions of strict confidentiality. The third call was to her sister, Angela, or the only family member Rachel trusted enough to share what she had found. Angela arrived first, driving 3 hours from the city with the kind of urgency that only sisters could summon without explanation. She walked through the front door, took one look at Rachel's face, and said nothing. She followed Rachel to the bathroom without questions. She watched as Rachel moved the mirror, pressed the wall, turned the handle, and pushed the bathtub aside. She descended the stone steps with her hand on Rachel's shoulder, and when they reached the bottom and the flashlight illuminated the shelves and the boxes and the gleaming contents within, Angela made a sound that Rachel would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a gasp or a scream or a word. It was a breath held so long that its release carried the weight of every argument the two sisters had ever had about money, about fairness, about whether their grandmother had truly left them nothing. The appraiser arrived at 3 in the afternoon. His name was Martin Shale, and he was a quiet man in his 60s who wore glasses that he adjusted constantly and who carried a leather case of tools that he handled with the reverence of a surgeon. He descended the steps, and for the first 30 minutes, he said nothing at all. He moved from shelf to shelf, opening boxes, examining stones through a loop, weighing gold bars on a portable scale, photographing coins with a camera that looked more expensive than Rachel's car. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but his hands were not. He asked Rachel to sit down, and she told him she preferred to stand. He told her that a definitive appraisal would require weeks. Individual stones would need to be examined by specialists. The gold would need to be assayed. The coins would require numismatic authentication. The documents in the sealed tubes could contain anything from property deeds to bearer bonds, and their value would depend on verification processes that could take months. Rachel told him she understood. She asked him for a range. Not a promise, not a guarantee. A range. Martin Shale adjusted his glasses, looked at his notes, looked at the shelves, and then looked at Rachel with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. It was not pity. It was not condescension. It was the expression of a man who understood the distance between where she stood and where she was about to arrive, and who wanted her to be ready for the crossing. He told her that based on a preliminary assessment, the gold alone, the bars and coins he had examined, was worth approximately $12 million at current market prices. The gemstones, if authenticated as natural and historically sourced, could range from 15 to 40 million, depending on quality, provenance, and market conditions. The mounted jewelry, particularly the pieces that appeared to be from European estates of the early 20th century, added another layer of value that he could not estimate without further research, but that was significant. Conservatively, the total value of the collection was between $30 and $60 million. At the upper end, if the most exceptional stones proved to be what he believed they were, the figure could exceed $100 million. Rachel did not sit down. She did not cry. She did not make the sound her sister had made. She stood perfectly still in the underground room that her great-great-uncle had filled with the treasures of a collapsing world. And she felt the floor beneath her shift, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The math that had governed her life, the math of $12 an hour and $47 in the checking account and $11.32 in a jar, was not erased. It was obliterated, replaced by numbers so large they belonged to a language she had not yet learned to speak. She thanked Martin Shale. She asked him to prepare a written preliminary report. She asked him to recommend specialists for the individual categories. And then she climbed the stairs back to the bathroom. She sat on the edge of the bathtub that was still pushed against the window and called her lawyer. Patricia Okonkwo answered on the second ring. Rachel told her the preliminary figures. There was a silence on the line that lasted exactly 4 seconds, and then Patricia said 2 words that Rachel would carry with her through everything that followed. We move. Within 24 hours, Patricia had filed an emergency motion to halt the foreclosure. The motion was accompanied by documentation from Martin Shale, confirming the existence of assets sufficient to resolve all outstanding debts on the property and then some. The county responded with the bureaucratic equivalent of confusion, but the law was clear. Assets existed. Debts could be satisfied. The process was paused. Within 72 hours, the property taxes were paid in full. The mortgage arrears were cleared. The insurance was reinstated. The contractors that Rachel had called months earlier, the ones whose estimates had seemed like ransom demands, were called again. This time, when they gave their numbers, Rachel said yes. Word spread, as it always does in small communities, not through announcements, but through observation. The contractors' trucks parked on Birch Lane were noticed. The dumpster that appeared in the driveway was noticed. The new roof going up was noticed. Neighbors who had watched the house deteriorate for years, who had shaken their heads and murmured about declining property values, and what a shame it was, I now stood on their porches and watched the resurrection with expressions that shifted from curiosity to surprise, to something that looked uncomfortable in those who had been most vocal in their criticism. Rachel's neighbor, Linda Hargrove, had been the loudest. She was a woman who communicated concern through complaints and who had submitted 3 formal requests to the city about the condition of Rachel's property. She had told anyone who would listen that the house was an eyesore, that Rachel was irresponsible, that it was only a matter of time before the whole place was condemned. She had said these things at neighborhood meetings, at the grocery store, at the school pickup line where Rachel's daughters could hear every word. Linda appeared on Rachel's porch 2 days after the contractors began, carrying a plate of cookies and an expression that Rachel recognized immediately as the face of someone who wanted information more than they wanted to offer kindness. Rachel accepted the cookies, thanked her politely, and closed the door without inviting her inside. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of years. Rachel was not cruel. She was not vindictive. She was a woman who had been mocked while she struggled, dismissed while she persevered, and pitied by people who had never once offered to help. The closed door was not revenge. It was a boundary, drawn quietly and without explanation, between the life she had endured and the life she was about to begin. Her ex-husband David called on the 4th day. She had not spoken to him in 7 months. His voice carried the same casual indifference that had characterized the final year of their marriage, the tone of a man who believed that distance absolved him of responsibility. He had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that things were changing at the house on Birch Lane. He asked how the girls were doing. He asked about the roof. He circled the subject for 3 minutes before arriving at the question he had actually called to ask, which was whether Rachel had come into some money. She told him the girls were fine. She told him the roof was being replaced. She told him that any financial questions could be directed to her attorney. And then she hung up, not in anger, but with the steady certainty of a woman who had learned to measure her words as carefully as her grandmother had measured hers. The authentication process began in earnest during the second week. Martin Shale had assembled a team of 4 specialists, each one handling a different category of the collection. A gemologist from New York arrived with equipment that filled 2 cases and spent 3 days in the underground room, emerging each evening with notes that grew longer and more detailed. A numismatist from Chicago examined the coins and identified several that predated the American Revolution, their origins traced to European mints that had been producing currency for centuries before the house on Birch Lane existed. A precious metals expert confirmed the purity and weight of the gold bars, each one stamped with hallmarks consistent with refineries operating in Switzerland and South Africa during the 1920s and 30s. The sealed tubes proved to be the most complex element of the collection. They contained documents written in multiple languages, some in German, others in French, a few in Portuguese. Patricia Okonkwo arranged for translation services, and as the contents were revealed, the scope of Arthur Calloway's life and travels became clearer. There were certificates of authenticity for individual stones, issued by gemological authorities in Amsterdam and Antwerp. There were bills of sale from estate auctions in Vienna and Prague. There were letters from dealers and collectors, correspondences that traced the movement of specific pieces across borders and decades. Each document added a layer to the provenance of the collection, transforming it from a remarkable discovery into a historically documented treasure with a clear chain of custody. The numbers grew as the authentication progressed. The initial estimate of $30 to $60 million shifted upward as individual pieces were identified and valued. A single ruby, the one set in the pendant Rachel had found on her first night in the room, was identified as a Burmese pigeon blood ruby of exceptional clarity and size. Martin Shale told her that stones of this quality had sold at auction for between $8 and $12 million individually. There were 4 such rubies in the collection. There were also sapphires from Kashmir, emeralds from Colombia, and diamonds, whose characteristics suggested origins in the legendary mines of Golconda, the same source that had produced some of the most famous gemstones in history. Rachel listened to each report with the same stillness she had maintained since the first night, and she asked questions that were practical rather than emotional. She wanted to know about insurance, about security, about the legal implications of possessing a collection of this magnitude. Patricia Okonkwo handled these concerns with the efficiency of someone who recognized that the window of vulnerability was real and that protecting the collection required immediate and decisive action. A security firm was hired to install a monitoring system at the house. The underground room was fitted with climate control equipment that would maintain the conditions that had preserved the collection for 80 years. The entrance was reinforced, and access was restricted to a list of individuals approved by Rachel and her attorney. The collection was insured for a preliminary figure that would be adjusted as authentication continued, but even the initial policy represented a number that made the insurance agent pause before confirming. Through all of this, Rachel continued to clean houses 3 days a week. She did not quit her job. She did not make dramatic changes to her daily routine. She drove her daughters to school in the same car with the rebuilt transmission. She shopped at the same grocery store where she had stocked shelves at night. She wore the same clothes, walked the same paths, maintained the same rhythms that had sustained her through years of hardship. The change was internal, fundamental, but she was not ready to let it reshape the surface of her life. Not yet. Not until she understood fully what she had and what it meant. Her daughters knew something had changed. Lily, who was 8, unasked why there were so many trucks at the house, and why Mommy seemed different. Not sad different, but thinking different. Megan, who was 12 and possessed her grandmother's talent for observation, without the patience to keep her observations to herself, asked directly whether they were rich now. Rachel told Lily that the house was getting fixed. She told Megan that they had been given a gift by someone who loved them very much, and that understanding the gift would take time, and that in the meantime, their job was to be patient and to be kind, and to remember that what mattered most hadn't changed. Megan looked at her mother with an expression that Eleanor Calloway would have recognized, the expression of a woman being born inside a girl's body, sharp and skeptical and quietly fierce. She said, "Okay," but the way she said it carried a footnote that Rachel understood. Okay for now. More questions later. The final preliminary appraisal was delivered on a Tuesday afternoon, 23 days after Rachel had found the letter behind the bathroom mirror. Martin Shale sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the foreclosure papers had once rested, and presented a document that was 64 pages long and bound in a blue cover with his firm's name embossed in gold. He walked Rachel through the summary with the careful attention of a man who understood that numbers of this size needed to be absorbed gradually. The total preliminary value of the Arthur Calloway collection, pending final authentication of certain individual pieces and subject to market conditions at the time of any future sale, was estimated at $114 million. Rachel looked at the number. She looked at Martin Shale. She looked at her sister Angela, who had driven 3 hours again to be present for this moment, and who was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She looked at Patricia Okonkwo, who was already making notes about next steps in a legal pad that she held at an angle no one else could read. And then Rachel looked at the ceiling, at the water stain above the bathroom door that had started everything, the stain that had been there for months and that she had been unable to fix because the cheapest estimate was $4,000, and she had $47 in her checking account. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She breathed, one long, slow breath that carried the weight of every sleepless night, and every late check, and every closed door, and every whispered judgment, and every moment of doubt that had brought her to this kitchen, to this table, to this number that did not merely change her life, but rewrote it from the foundation up. $114 million, hidden beneath a bathtub, sealed behind a mirror, preserved by the silence of generations, and revealed by the only force strong enough to break that silence, which was need. Eleanor had been right. The house was not empty. It had never been empty. And Rachel, who had spent years believing she had inherited nothing but problems, now understood that she had inherited everything. The timing was not luck. It was love, patient and hidden, and waiting for the moment when it would matter most. The news did not break all at once. It seeped outward the way water finds cracks in old stone, slowly at first, and then with a momentum that could not be contained. Rachel had been careful. Patricia Okonkwo had been careful. Martin Shale and his team had signed confidentiality agreements that carried penalties severe enough to discourage casual conversation. But the visible changes to the house on Birch Lane told their own story, and in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business better than their own, the visible was enough to start the whispers. The first wave was speculation. Neighbors noticed the security cameras installed at the corners of the house. They noticed the unfamiliar cars in the driveway, sedans that were too clean and too new to belong to anyone on the street. They noticed the men in suits who arrived with briefcases and left with expressions that suggested they had seen something remarkable. They noticed that Rachel, who had always moved through the neighborhood with the quiet efficiency of a woman managing too many responsibilities, now moved with something else. Not arrogance, not pride, something subtler, a stillness in her posture that had not been there before, as though the weight she had carried for years had been set down so recently that her body was still adjusting to its absence. Linda Hargrove was the first to attempt a direct inquiry. She appeared at Rachel's door again, this time without cookies, her expression stripped of the pretense of neighborly concern. She asked Rachel directly what was happening. She mentioned the trucks, the suits, the cameras. She said the neighborhood had a right to know if something was going on that affected property values. She used the phrase property values 3 times in under a minute, which Rachel counted silently, the way she had once counted coins. Rachel told Linda that the house was undergoing renovations and that she appreciated the neighborhood's interest. She said nothing else. The door closed again, gently, without force, and Linda stood on the porch for a full 30 seconds before turning away. That evening, the phone calls began. Linda called 4 neighbors before dinner. By the following morning, 3 theories were circulating on Birch Lane, each one more elaborate than the last, and none of them close to the truth. The second wave came from family. Rachel's mother, Diane, and who had distanced herself from Eleanor's house years ago after a disagreement about the property that had never been resolved, called on a Wednesday evening with the careful warmth of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation. She asked about the girls. She asked about the weather. She circled for 7 minutes before mentioning that she had heard from Angela that Rachel had found something in the house. And was it true? And what exactly had been found? And why had no one told her sooner? Rachel had anticipated this call. She had discussed it with Patricia, who had advised a specific approach. Be honest about the existence of the discovery. Be vague about the specifics. Invite no assumptions about distribution or entitlement. And above all, don't apologize for the timing. The discovery was Rachel's. The house was Rachel's. While Eleanor's letter had been addressed to Rachel, these were not negotiable points, and allowing them to become so would invite complications that could consume years. Rachel told her mother that a collection of historical items had been found in the house. She told her that the items were being authenticated and appraised. She told her that legal counsel was managing the process and that details would be shared when appropriate. She did not mention the value. She did not describe the underground room. She did not read Eleanor's letter aloud, though her mother asked twice. Diane's response moved through several stages in quick succession. Surprise gave way to excitement, which gave way to calculation, which settled into a hurt silence that Rachel recognized from years of navigating her mother's emotional landscape. Diane said that she should have been told immediately. She said that the house had been her mother's, and therefore anything in it was a family matter. She said the word family with an emphasis that implied ownership rather than affection. Rachel listened. She did not argue. When her mother finished, Rachel said that she loved her, that she understood her feelings, and that she would be in touch when there was more to share. The conversation ended with a silence that was not hostile, but was not warm either. It was the silence of 2 women who had spent years on opposite sides of the same inheritance, and who were only now beginning to understand how deep the divide actually ran. The third wave was institutional. Once the preliminary appraisal was filed as part of the legal proceedings to halt the foreclosure, the information entered systems that operated beyond Rachel's control. Court records, while not publicly broadcast, were accessible to those who knew how to look. A clerk mentioned the filing to a colleague. The colleague mentioned it to a friend who worked at the local newspaper. The friend made a phone call to Patricia Okonkwo's office, asking for comment on a story about a significant discovery in a residential property. Patricia handled it with the precision of someone who had managed sensitive cases before. She released a statement confirming that a collection of historical items had been found in a private residence, that the items were undergoing professional appraisal, and that the property owner requested privacy during the process. The statement was measured, professional, and intentionally boring. It was also entirely insufficient to contain the story that was already forming. The newspaper article appeared on a Friday. It was a short piece, carefully worded, citing public records and unnamed sources. It mentioned the foreclosure proceedings, the discovery of items of potential historical significance, and the involvement of appraisers from outside the region. It did not mention specific values. It did not name the items. But it named the street, and it named the neighborhood, and in a town this size, that was enough. Rachel read the article at the kitchen table while her daughters ate breakfast. She read it once, folded the newspaper, and placed it in the recycling bin. Lily asked what was in the paper, and Rachel said nothing important. Megan looked at her mother with the expression that had become familiar over recent weeks, the look of a 12-year-old who knew she was being managed and who was choosing, for now, to allow it. The response to the article was immediate and varied. Rachel's phone rang 11 times before noon. She answered 3 calls, all from people she trusted, and let the rest go to voicemail. The messages ranged from congratulatory to curious to openly envious. One message, from a man she had gone to high school with and had not spoken to in 15 years, offered to help her invest the money. Another, from a woman who attended the same church, asked if Rachel would consider donating to the building fund. A third, from a number she did not recognize, offered to buy the collection site unseen for what the caller described as a very competitive price. Patricia had warned her about this. The attorney had described it as the gravity phase, and the period after a discovery of this magnitude, when everyone and everything began to orbit the new center of mass. People who had never called would call. People who had never cared would care. Opportunities that sounded generous would arrive with strings invisible to the untrained eye. The only protection was patience, and the only currency that mattered was time. Rachel followed the advice. She changed her phone number. She asked Patricia to serve as the sole point of contact for all inquiries. She installed a gate at the end of the driveway that the contractors had rebuilt, and that now seemed to serve a purpose beyond aesthetics. She continued to drive her daughters to school, to shop at the same stores, to walk the same streets. But the streets no longer felt the same. The eyes that followed her carried questions that had not existed a month ago, and the silence that greeted her in certain conversations was the silence of people recalculating. The hardest part was not the attention. It was not the phone calls, or the newspaper article, or the neighbors standing on their porches with expressions that flickered between admiration and resentment. The hardest part was the people who had been unkind, when kindness would have cost them nothing, and who now appeared at her door with smiles that arrived too late to be anything other than strategic. David called again. This time his tone was different. The casual indifference had been replaced by something warmer, something that sounded almost like the voice she had fallen in love with years ago, before the slow erosion had stripped it of sincerity. He told her he had been thinking about the girls. He told her he wanted to be more involved. He mentioned the possibility of visiting, of spending time together as a family, of rebuilding what had been lost. He did not mention money directly, but the word hovered behind every sentence, like a shadow cast by a light he thought she could not see. Rachel let him talk. She had learned, over years of managing conversations with people who wanted things from her, the power of silence. When David finished, she told him that the girls would love to see him. She told him that a visit could be arranged through the existing custody agreement. She told him that, if he wanted to restart his child support payments, he could contact Patricia's office for the updated terms. And then she said something that surprised even her, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. She told him that the best time to have been a good father was before any of this happened. The second best time was now. But now came with a clarity that before had lacked, and she would be watching to see which version of him showed up. David was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the rehearsed warmth. He said he understood. Whether he did or not, Rachel could not be certain. But she had said what needed to be said, and the words sat between them like a door that could only be opened from one side. The community response deepened as weeks passed, and the scope of the discovery became harder to conceal. The appraisers continued their work. Individual pieces were sent to laboratories and auction houses for verification. Each confirmation added to the total, and each addition widened the distance between Rachel's old life and her new one. The ruby pendant was authenticated as a Burmese pigeon blood ruby of 7.3 carats, internally flawless, with documentation tracing its provenance to a noble estate in Vienna that had been dissolved in 1922. Its estimated auction value was $9.4 million. The Kashmir sapphires, 3 of them, were confirmed as natural and unheated, each exceeding 5 carats, with a combined estimated value of $14 million. The Golconda diamonds, 2 stones of extraordinary size and historical significance, were tentatively valued at $23 million, pending further analysis that would require months of additional research. The gold bars numbered 47 in total, but their combined weight exceeding 60 pounds, their purity confirmed at 99.9%. At current market prices, the gold alone was worth approximately $18.6 million. The coins included pieces from the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Spanish colonial period, and the early American Republic. Several were identified as extremely rare, with individual values ranging from $50,000 to over $1 million each. The numismatist told Rachel that 3 of the coins were previously unknown examples of their type and would rewrite sections of existing catalogs once published. The documents from the sealed tubes proved equally remarkable. Among them were original certificates from the Gemological Institute of Amsterdam, a handwritten correspondence from dealers who had since become legendary figures in the gemstone trade, and a personal journal kept by Arthur Calloway himself, written in English, with occasional passages in French and German. The journal described his travels, his acquisitions, his growing fear of the political catastrophe unfolding in Europe, and his decision to bring the collection home to be hidden. The final entry, dated November 14, 1938, read simply, "The work is done. The house will keep what the world cannot." Patricia Okonkwo presented Rachel with options that ranged from conservative to transformative. The collection could be sold in its entirety through a major auction house, as a process that would likely yield the highest total return, but would take 12 to 18 months and attract international attention. Individual pieces could be sold privately, providing immediate liquidity while preserving the remainder of the collection for future appreciation. Alternatively, the collection could be held intact, insured and secured as a long-term asset that would almost certainly increase in value over time. Rachel chose a middle path. She authorized the private sale of a selection of gold bars and coins sufficient to address her immediate needs, which Patricia defined as a figure that made Rachel laugh for the first time in weeks. Immediate needs, according to the attorney, included paying off all debts, establishing trust funds for both daughters, funding the complete renovation of the house, and creating a reserve sufficient to eliminate financial anxiety for the foreseeable future. The total was $4.2 million, drawn from assets that represented less than 4% of the collection's total value. The rest would wait. Rachel was not in a hurry. She had spent years learning to be patient with less. She could afford to be patient with more. The renovation of the house on Birch Lane became, in itself, a kind of narrative that the neighborhood followed, with the attention usually reserved for television dramas. The roof was replaced first, not with the cheapest available option, but with materials chosen for durability and historical accuracy, matching the style of the original construction as closely as modern building codes allowed. The porch was rebuilt entirely. the rotting steps replaced with solid oak, the plywood patch discarded and burned in a fire that Rachel watched with her daughters one evening, the three of them sitting on new steps that did not creak or shift beneath their weight. The furnace was replaced with a modern heating system that operated in silence, a silence so complete that Rachel noticed its absence for days afterward, having grown accustomed to the groaning that had served as the house's heartbeat for years. The kitchen was updated, with appliances that worked consistently, and countertops that did not chip when Lily set down her cereal bowl too quickly. The bathroom, the room where everything had begun, was restored with particular care. The tile was replaced. The plumbing was modernized. A new mirror hung on the wall above the sink, positioned precisely where Eleanor's mirror had been, and though now it concealed nothing but the wall behind it. The bathtub remained. Rachel had considered replacing it, but something stopped her. The clawfoot tub was original to the house, installed by Henry Calloway in 1923, and it had served as the guardian of the most important secret the family had ever kept. It was restored, refinished, and returned to its position above the hatch, which was now sealed with a modern security system rather than a brass lock. The rollers were still there, hidden beneath a new baseboard that matched the original. Rachel liked knowing they were there. She liked the continuity of it, the idea that the house remembered its own secrets, even as it healed. The underground room was professionally renovated without altering its fundamental character. Climate control was installed discreetly. Lighting was added. The stone shelves were cleaned and reinforced. The collection remained in place, each piece documented, photographed, and cataloged in a database maintained by Martin Shale's firm. The room that Arthur Calloway had built in 1938 was now a museum-grade vault, protected by technology he could never have imagined, but sustained by the same principle that had guided his original construction, which was that some things were worth protecting from a world that did not always deserve them. Rachel's daughters adapted to the change in ways that reflected their ages and temperaments. Lily, at 8, accepted the new reality with the flexibility that children possess and adults envy. She liked the new kitchen. She liked that the porch no longer had a warning sign. She liked that her mother no longer sat at the table at night with the expression that Lily had learned to recognize as the face mommy makes when the numbers are bad. She did not fully understand what had happened, and Rachel was content to let understanding arrive at its own pace. Megan was different. At 12, she occupied the territory between childhood and awareness, where every change demanded explanation and every explanation demanded interrogation. She asked how much the collection was worth. Rachel told her a lot, and Megan said that was not a real answer. Rachel agreed and told her it was the answer she was going to get for now. Megan asked if they were going to move. Rachel said no. Megan asked if she was going to quit her jobs. Rachel said she had already reduced her hours at both. Megan asked if they were going to be different now. Rachel sat on the edge of Megan's bed and thought about the question for a long time before answering. She told her daughter that they were already different. They had been different the moment the mirror came off the wall. What mattered was not whether they changed, because change was inevitable, and resisting it was as pointless as patching a roof with tape. What mattered was what they chose to keep. The things that had sustained them through the hard years, the patience, the resourcefulness, the understanding that money solved problems but didn't create meaning, those were worth keeping. Everything else could be renegotiated. Megan listened with the intensity that characterized her approach to everything. When Rachel finished, Megan said, "Okay again. But this time, the footnote was different. It was not okay for now. It was okay, I understand." And Rachel, who had learned to read her daughter the way she had learned to read numbers and foreclosure notices and the expressions of people who wanted things they had not earned, believed her. The community's relationship to Rachel evolved through stages that resembled the process of grief, though what was being mourned was not loss, but the comfort of certainty. The people of Birch Lane and the surrounding streets had known Rachel Calloway as a struggling single mother who cleaned houses and stocked shelves and could not afford to fix her roof. That Rachel was familiar. She fit into a category that the community understood, the category of people who worked hard and got by, and whose difficulties served as a quiet reassurance to those who were doing slightly better. The new Rachel did not fit. She occupied a space that the community had no template for, a neighbor who had been at the bottom and was now, by any measure, at the top, and whose journey from one to the other had not involved any of the steps that conventional wisdom prescribed. She had not married well. She had not built a business. She had not won a lottery or received an inheritance from a wealthy relative in the traditional sense. She had found something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the very floor that people had walked across while shaking their heads at her inability to maintain the house above it. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Rachel herself. Linda Hargrove's transformation was the most visible and, in its way, the most instructive. Linda, who had submitted complaints and muttered about property values, and who had brought cookies to Rachel's door as a vehicle for gossip, underwent a recalibration that took approximately 3 weeks. During the first week, she was silent, watchful, absorbing information with the efficiency of someone who had spent years practicing the art of neighborhood surveillance. During the second week, she began to speak warmly about Rachel in conversations where Rachel's name had previously been preceded by phrases like, "that poor woman," or "someone should really do something." During the third week, Linda appeared at Rachel's new gate with a bottle of wine and an apology that was so carefully constructed it sounded like a legal document. Rachel accepted the wine. She did not accept the apology, not because she was unwilling to forgive, but because the apology was not actually directed at her. It was directed at the new version of her, the version with resources and influence and the ability to affect property values in a positive direction. The old Rachel, the one who had needed kindness and been offered judgment, was not the person Linda was apologizing to, and that distinction mattered. She told Linda that she appreciated the gesture. She told her that the neighborhood had always been important to her and that she hoped they could move forward as good neighbors. She did not mention the complaints. She did not mention the school pickup line. She did not mention the years of whispered criticism that had reached her through channels Linda never realized were open. She simply smiled, accepted the wine, and closed the gate. The grace Rachel demonstrated was not performance. It was not the calculated magnanimity of someone who wanted to appear noble. It was the natural expression of a woman who had spent years developing patience under conditions that demanded it, and who now found that patience served equally well in abundance as it had in scarcity. She did not need Linda's approval. She did not need the neighborhood's validation. She had needed those things once, when isolation and poverty had made every relationship a potential resource. But that need had been dissolved by the same discovery that had dissolved her debts. What replaced the need was something quieter and more durable. It was the understanding that people's responses to her fortune revealed their character more clearly than her misfortune ever had. Those who had been kind when she had nothing continued to be kind. Those who had been indifferent revealed the conditional nature of their warmth. And those who had been cruel scrambled to revise their history, editing their memories with the same urgency that Arthur Calloway's enemies might have edited maps to erase the roots that led to his treasures. Rachel kept a mental inventory of these responses, not out of spite, but out of the practical wisdom that her grandmother had cultivated and that the letter behind the mirror had finally transmitted. Eleanor had written, "Be careful, be wise, be braver than I was." Rachel understood now that the bravery Eleanor had lacked was not the courage to open the hatch and look inside. It was the courage to let the discovery change her relationship with the world above, to accept that wealth of this kind would test every bond she had, and that some bonds would not survive the test. The church responded with characteristic ambiguity. Pastor Mitchell, a man Rachel respected for his sincerity, if not always for his judgment, visited the house on a Saturday afternoon and sat in the renovated kitchen with a cup of coffee he barely touched. He spoke about stewardship and gratitude and the responsibilities that accompanied blessings. He did not ask for money directly, but his language created a gravitational field around the subject that was impossible to ignore. Rachel listened, nodded at appropriate intervals, and told him that she intended to support the community in meaningful ways, and that those ways would become clear in time. The pastor left satisfied, or at least patient, which in Rachel's experience amounted to the same thing. She had learned from Patricia that generosity was most effective when it was strategic rather than reactive, and that saying yes to every request in the early months would establish patterns that could never be reversed. She would give. She intended to give substantially, but she would do so on her own terms, directed by her own values, guided by her own understanding of what the community actually needed rather than what it asked for. The first act of deliberate generosity came 6 weeks after the discovery. Rachel established a fund through Patricia's office, anonymous at first, but designed to provide emergency financial assistance to families in the school district facing foreclosure, eviction, or medical debt. The fund was administered by a local nonprofit with strict criteria and transparent reporting. Rachel did not attach her name to it. She did not announce it. She simply ensured that the next woman who stood in her kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, staring at numbers that did not add up, would have a number to call and a voice on the other end that said, "We can help." The second act was more personal. She paid off the medical bills that had accumulated during her father's illness 3 years earlier, bills that her mother had been managing with the same desperate arithmetic that Rachel had applied to the house. She did this without telling Diane in advance, or directing Patricia to contact the medical providers directly and settle the accounts. When Diane called, confused and tearful, Rachel said only that the money was there and the bills were not, and that the rest of the conversation could wait until they were ready to have it. Diane's tears were complicated. They carried gratitude and relief, and the sharp edge of pride wounded by the realization that her daughter had done what she could not. The relationship between them did not heal instantly. It could not. Years of distance and disagreement had created scar tissue that no amount of money could dissolve. But the bills were gone, and with them went a source of stress that had poisoned every conversation between them for years. The space that opened was small, but it was enough for something new to begin growing. Rachel's brother, Marcus, who lived 2 states away and who had maintained a quiet, steady relationship with her throughout the difficult years, asked nothing. He called to say congratulations. He asked how the girls were doing. He told a joke that made her laugh so hard she spilled her coffee. He did not mention money. He did not ask for details. He simply showed up by phone because the distance was real, and reminded her that some relationships did not require recalibration because they had never been calibrated to anything other than love. She told Marcus everything. She read him Eleanor's letter over the phone. She described the underground room, the shelves, the stones that caught light and transformed it. She told him the numbers, all of them, and listened to the silence that followed, not the silence of calculation, but the silence of a brother absorbing the magnitude of what his sister's life had become. When he finally spoke, he said, "Grandma Eleanor was something else." And Rachel said, "Yes. Yes, she was." The media interest intensified as the story moved beyond the local newspaper. A regional television station sent a reporter who stood outside the gate on Birch Lane and delivered a segment that described the discovery in terms that were breathless and imprecise. The segment used phrases like hidden treasure and fortune beneath the floorboards, and the kind of story you only hear about in movies. It showed the exterior of the house, the new roof gleaming in the afternoon light, the porch rebuilt and sturdy, the security cameras visible at the corners. It did not show Rachel. She had declined all interview requests, gone to a decision that Patricia had advised and that Rachel had embraced with relief. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Rachel's old phone number, the one she had changed, was circulating online, and 3 strangers appeared at the gate asking to see the collection. Patricia issued a formal statement requesting privacy and noting that any trespassing would be prosecuted. The strangers left. Others arrived. The cycle continued for 10 days before the news cycle moved on, drawn away by other stories in other places, the attention of the world being both intense and brief, like a searchlight sweeping across a landscape and illuminating nothing long enough to truly understand it. Through it all, Rachel maintained the rhythm of her days. She had reduced her cleaning work to 1 day a week, not because she needed the money, but because the work itself provided a structure that she was not ready to abandon. The physical act of cleaning, the repetitive motions, the satisfaction of visible improvement, grounded her in a way that nothing else did. Her employer, a woman named Sandra, who ran the cleaning service with the efficiency of a military operation, had noticed the changes in Rachel's life and asked no questions, which Rachel appreciated more than any congratulations. She had left the grocery stocking job entirely. The fluorescent lights and the late hours had served their purpose, and that purpose was over. She did not feel guilt about leaving. She felt the same practical acceptance that characterized all her decisions, the understanding that resources should be directed where they were most effective, and that her time was now more valuable than $12 an hour. The trust funds for Lily and Megan were established with terms that Patricia had crafted after lengthy discussions with Rachel about values, timing, and the dangers of inherited wealth arriving too early in a young person's life. The funds were substantial but structured. The girls would have access to educational expenses immediately. Living expenses would become available at 21. Full access to the principal would not occur until 30, by which time, Rachel hoped, they would have developed the judgment and discipline to manage wealth rather than be managed by it. She explained this to Megan on an evening when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet. Megan listened with characteristic intensity and asked why 30. Rachel told her that 30 was the age at which Eleanor had learned the secret of the house and had chosen not to act on it. The irony was not lost on Megan, who pointed out that Grandma Eleanor never spent the money at all, so maybe 30 was too late. Rachel smiled and said that was exactly the kind of thinking that made 30 the right age. The renovation of the house was completed in the 4th month after the discovery. Rachel stood on the front porch on a warm evening and looked at the street she had lived on for years. The houses on either side were unchanged. The trees along the sidewalk stood as they always had, their roots cracking the concrete in the same patterns she had memorized during countless walks to the bus stop, to the store, to the school, to the second job. The view was familiar, but the woman standing on the porch was not the same woman who had taped a plywood patch over a rotting step and painted a sign that read, "Watch your step." That woman had done everything right. She had worked. She had sacrificed. She had shown up every day for her daughters and for a house that demanded more than it gave. And none of it had been enough. The math had been merciless. The system had been indifferent. The neighbors had been unkind. The future had been a foreclosure notice taped to the front door, curling at the edges, its ink bleeding in the rain. And then a mirror had been crooked. A letter had been found. A key had fallen onto a kitchen table. And beneath the floor of a bathroom in a house that everyone believed was worthless, a fortune had been waiting for someone brave enough to look. Rachel did not believe the discovery was luck. Luck implied randomness, and nothing about the chain of events felt random. Eleanor had placed the letter deliberately. The mirror had shifted because the earth had shifted, and the earth had shifted because the world was always in motion, always rearranging itself, always offering new patterns to those who paid attention. The discovery was the intersection of preparation and necessity, of a great-uncle's foresight and a grandmother's patience, and a mother's refusal to give up on a house that everyone else had given up on long ago. She thought about the people who had dismissed her, not with anger, but with the clear-eyed understanding that their dismissal had been a reflection of their own limitations rather than hers. They had looked at the house and seen only what was broken. They had looked at her and seen only what was lacking. They had never thought to ask what might be hidden, what might be waiting, what might be preserved beneath the surface of a life that appeared to have nothing left to offer. That was the lesson Rachel carried forward. Not that houses contain treasure, because most do not. Not that patience is always rewarded, because sometimes it is not. But that the value of a thing is never determined by those who look only at the surface. The people who had mocked the house on Birch Lane had been looking at paint and plaster and rotting wood. They had never looked deeper. And because they had never looked deeper, they had missed everything that mattered. The auction house contacted Patricia in the 5th month. They had been following the story through professional channels, to the gemological community being smaller and more interconnected than most people realized. A representative flew in from New York, a woman named Claire Fontaine, who dressed in black and spoke with the measured precision of someone accustomed to handling objects worth more than buildings. She toured the underground room with the reverence of a pilgrim visiting a shrine, her gloved hands hovering over cases without touching, her eyes cataloging details that even Martin Shale had not yet noted. Claire told Rachel that the Arthur Calloway collection was one of the most significant private holdings discovered in the past 50 years. She compared it to finds that Rachel had read about in articles forwarded by Patricia, in collections that had surfaced from Swiss bank vaults and European attics, and the sealed rooms of estates whose owners had died without heirs. The difference, Claire noted, was provenance. Arthur's journal, his correspondence, his certificates of authenticity, these created a documentary trail that most hidden collections lacked. The story was not merely valuable, it was verifiable. And in the world of high-value collectibles, verifiability was the difference between a fortune and a legend. Rachel asked Claire what she recommended. Claire said that the collection deserved to be seen. Not all of it, not immediately, but the exceptional pieces, the Burmese rubies, the Kashmir sapphires, the Golconda diamonds. These belonged in a setting where their beauty and history could be appreciated by people who understood what they represented. So she suggested a curated auction, an event designed not merely to sell, but to tell the story of a man who had traveled the world, gathering beauty, and a family that had kept it safe through a century of upheaval. The idea appealed to Rachel in a way she had not expected. She had assumed that selling meant losing, that parting with pieces of the collection would diminish what Eleanor had preserved. But Claire's framing was different. Selling wasn't losing, it was sharing. The stones that had sat in darkness for 80 years would enter the world again, would be worn and admired and passed through new hands, would begin new chapters in stories that Arthur Calloway could never have imagined. The collection was not a static treasure. It was a living inheritance, and living things needed to move. Rachel authorized the sale of 12 pieces, and carefully selected for their combination of beauty, historical significance, and market demand. Patricia negotiated terms with the auction house that were favorable by any standard, reflecting both the quality of the collection and the leverage that Rachel's position afforded. The auction was scheduled for the following spring, giving the authentication process time to complete and the market time to build anticipation. In the meantime, Rachel turned her attention to the parts of her life that money could not fix. The relationship with her mother remained fragile, held together by the medical bills Rachel had paid, and the awkward conversations that followed. Diane visited the house on Birch Lane for the first time in 3 years, on walking through rooms that had been transformed by renovation, and through a kitchen where the foreclosure papers no longer occupied the table. She looked at everything with the careful attention of someone searching for something she could not name, and when she sat down at the table and Rachel placed a cup of coffee in front of her, Diane's eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide behind the steam. They talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Not about money, not about the collection, about Eleanor, about the woman who had kept a secret for decades and had trusted her granddaughter to find it at the right moment. Diane told stories Rachel had never heard, stories about Eleanor's stubbornness, her humor, her insistence on doing things her own way, even when her own way was harder than it needed to be. They laughed at the same memories and fell silent at the same ones. And by the time Diane left, something had shifted between them that no amount of money could have produced. It was not reconciliation. It was recognition, the mutual acknowledgement that they had both been shaped by the same woman, and that the distance between them was smaller than the years of disagreement had made it seem. Rachel's relationship with her work evolved in ways she had not anticipated. She stopped cleaning houses entirely in the 6th month, not because the work was beneath her, but because her time was increasingly consumed by the management of the collection and the decisions that accompanied it. She missed the simplicity of it, the tactile satisfaction of transforming a disordered space into a clean one, the way the work occupied her hands and freed her mind. She told Patricia this one afternoon, and Patricia looked at her with an expression that combined amusement and respect, and said that Rachel was the only person she had ever represented who missed cleaning other people's houses while sitting on $100 million. Rachel laughed and said that the cleaning had never been the problem. The problem had been that cleaning was all she could afford to do. Now that she could choose, the choosing itself became a new kind of work, one that required different muscles and different patience, but the same fundamental discipline. She was learning to manage wealth the way she had learned to manage poverty, one decision at a time, each one tested against the question that had governed her life since the girls were born. Is this good for them? Is this good for us? Is this the right thing to do? The school district felt the impact of Rachel's anonymous fund within months of its establishment. 3 families facing eviction received assistance that allowed them to remain in their homes. A single father whose daughter needed surgery that insurance would not cover received a call from the non-profit administrator informing him that the procedure had been funded. A grandmother raising 2 grandchildren after their parents' incarceration was able to repair her car, the car that took the children to school and herself to the job that kept the household running. None of these people knew Rachel's name. None of them connected their rescue to the house on Birch Lane. And that was exactly how Rachel wanted it. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that generosity without recognition was more powerful than generosity with it. The fund existed not to burnish her reputation, but to prevent other women from standing in their kitchens at midnight, counting coins, and wondering how long they could hold on. Every dollar the fund distributed carried the memory of those midnights, and Rachel wanted the money to arrive without the weight of obligation or the expectation of gratitude. She wanted it to arrive the way Eleanor's letter had arrived, silently, at the moment of greatest need, as though the universe itself had decided to intervene. The town gradually absorbed the reality of Rachel's transformation and adjusted to it with the uneven acceptance that characterized all significant change in close communities. Some people genuinely celebrated. They were the ones who had known Rachel during the hard years and who had offered whatever help they could, rides to the store, meals left on the porch, conversations that acknowledged difficulty without dwelling on it. These people did not change because they had not needed to. Their kindness had been unconditional, and unconditional kindness does not recalibrate when circumstances shift. Others adjusted with more difficulty. The ones who had kept their distance during the hard years now sought proximity, offering friendship that arrived with the suspicious punctuality of investors recognizing a rising stock. Rachel was polite to these people. She was not warm. The distinction was deliberate and maintained with the same discipline she applied to everything else. Politeness cost nothing and preserved peace. Warmth required trust, and trust was earned through consistency, not timing. The school became a microcosm of the broader community response. Lily's classmates knew nothing about the discovery and treated her as they always had, with the uncomplicated acceptance of 8-year-olds whose social hierarchies were based on who could run fastest and who shared snacks at lunch. Megan's classmates were different. At 12, awareness of money and status had already begun to shape relationships, and the rumors about her family had circulated with the efficiency of a communication network designed by evolution to transmit exactly this kind of information. Some classmates, who had barely acknowledged Megan before, now sought her out during lunch. Others, who had been friends, pulled back with the wariness of people who suspected that the ground between them had shifted in ways they could not yet measure. Megan handled it with a composure that Rachel found both admirable and heartbreaking. She did not seek attention. She did not reject it. She moved through the social landscape of middle school with the same watchful intelligence she had always possessed, reading people the way her mother read financial documents, and her grandmother had read the moods of a house that spoke in creaks and silences. When Rachel asked how school was going, Megan said fine, and the word carried the same layered meaning it always had, which was that things were complicated, and she was managing, and she would talk about it when she was ready. So the spring auction arrived with the kind of anticipation that the art and gemstone world reserved for events of genuine significance. Claire Fontaine had orchestrated the marketing with precision, releasing information about the collection in carefully timed intervals that built interest without satisfying it. The Burmese rubies were featured in a preview that generated coverage in publications Rachel had never heard of, but that apparently commanded the attention of people whose discretionary spending exceeded the GDP of small nations. Rachel did not attend the auction in person. She watched the results from her kitchen table, the same table where she had opened Eleanor's letter, where the foreclosure papers had once rested, where the brass key had fallen with a sound that changed everything. Patricia called with updates after each lot, and the first ruby sold for $11.2 million, exceeding its estimate by nearly $2 million. The Kashmir sapphires sold together as a set for $17.8 million. A pair of Golconda diamonds, presented with Arthur Calloway's original correspondence documenting their acquisition in 1931, sold for $26.4 million to a private collector whose identity was not disclosed. The total from the 12 pieces sold at auction was $73.6 million. After fees, commissions, and taxes, the net proceeds were deposited into accounts managed by a financial advisory team Patricia had assembled, a team whose qualifications Rachel had vetted with the same thoroughness she once applied to comparing prices on canned goods. Where Rachel sat at the kitchen table after the last call and listened to the house. The faucet no longer dripped. The furnace no longer groaned. The ceiling above the bathroom door bore fresh paint without a water stain in sight. The house was quiet in a way that was new. The silence of a structure that had been restored to soundness, every leak sealed, every crack repaired, every surface made whole. And yet the house was not silent at all. It hummed with the presence of 2 sleeping daughters and the memory of a grandmother who had known what lay beneath the floor and had chosen to wait. It carried the echo of a great-great-uncle who had traveled the world gathering beauty and brought it home to be hidden. It held the weight of a century of secrets and the lightness of a future that was no longer defined by scarcity. Rachel placed her hand on the kitchen table, feeling the grain of the wood, the warmth of the surface, the solidity of a piece of furniture that had witnessed everything, the desperation and the discovery, the numbers that did not add up, and the numbers that exceeded comprehension. She closed her eyes and thought of Eleanor, sitting in this same chair, knowing what was beneath her feet and choosing not to look, trusting that someday someone would need it more than she did. The timing was not luck. The timing was love. And love, Rachel understood now, was the one treasure that did not require authentication or appraisal to prove its worth. It simply endured beneath mirrors and floorboards and the silence of women who kept their own counsel until the moment arrived when it was needed most. The months that followed the auction moved with a rhythm Rachel had never experienced before. Time, which had once been measured by urgency, by the distance between paychecks and the countdown to due dates, now stretched open with a spaciousness that was both liberating and disorienting. She woke each morning in the same house on Birch Lane, in the same bedroom where she had lain awake, counting the drips from the faucet and the hours until the next shift. The room was different now, freshly painted, the window frames replaced, the curtains new. But the view was the same. The oak trees in the backyard still reached toward the sky with the patient ambition of things that measured progress in decades rather than days. The street still carried the sounds of neighbors leaving for work, of children walking to the bus stop, of a world that continued to operate on the same terms it always had, indifferent to the transformation that had occurred beneath one of its roofs. Rachel used the mornings for what she called her education. She had never managed money beyond the desperate arithmetic of survival, and the transition from scarcity to abundance required a literacy she did not yet possess. Patricia Okonkwo had assembled a team of financial advisors whose credentials filled pages and whose language initially felt like a foreign dialect spoken in her own kitchen. Asset allocation, diversification, tax-advantaged structures, charitable remainder trusts. Each term represented a decision, and each decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment in which it was made. She approached the learning with the same discipline she had applied to every other challenge in her life. She read the documents Patricia sent her, annotating them with questions written in the margins in handwriting that her grandmother would have recognized. She attended meetings with advisors and asked them to explain concepts until she understood them well enough to explain them to someone else. She refused to sign anything she had not read completely, a habit that initially frustrated professionals accustomed to clients who deferred to expertise, but that quickly earned their respect. Rachel Calloway was not a woman who let others make decisions on her behalf. She had survived too many years of having no decisions to make to surrender the ones she now possessed. For the financial architecture that emerged from these months of learning was conservative by the standards of people accustomed to wealth and radical by the standards of people accustomed to Rachel. The proceeds from the auction were divided into 3 tiers. The first tier, approximately 15%, was liquid. It sat in accounts that Rachel could access immediately, providing the kind of security that she had never known and that she valued above all other forms of wealth. The ability to pay any bill, to respond to any emergency, to wake up in the morning without the knot of financial anxiety that had lived in her chest for years. This was worth more to her than any gemstone in the underground room. The second tier, approximately 50%, was invested in a diversified portfolio designed for long-term growth with moderate risk. Rachel had pushed back against more aggressive strategies recommended by advisors who saw her youth and her timeline and calculated that she could afford volatility. She could not afford it, she told them, not because the math disagreed, but because she had spent too many years on the edge of financial catastrophe to be comfortable with the idea of voluntary risk. The advisors adjusted. They learned, as everyone who worked with Rachel eventually learned, that her decisions were shaped by experience rather than theory, and that experience had given her a relationship with money that no textbook could replicate. The third tier was the collection itself, the pieces that had not been sold, the majority of Arthur Calloway's life's work still resting on stone shelves in the underground room. These assets were appreciating in value steadily, their worth increasing not only through market dynamics, but through the growing reputation of the collection as a whole. The auction had generated international attention, and the pieces that remained were now objects of fascination for collectors, historians, and gemologists, who recognized that what Arthur had assembled was not merely a hoard of valuable objects, but a curated reflection of a specific moment in history, the last years before the world fractured along lines that would take decades to repair. Rachel thought about Arthur often. She had read his journal 3 times, each reading revealing details she had missed before. He wrote with a precision that reminded her of Eleanor, each sentence constructed with the care of someone who understood that words, like gemstones, derived their value from clarity rather than volume. He described the markets of Antwerp and the workshops of Amsterdam, the dealers who traded in stones the way others traded in grain, the quiet negotiations conducted in languages Arthur had taught himself through necessity rather than education. He wrote about the families who sold their heirlooms not because they wanted to, but because the world had made it impossible to keep them, and about the weight of knowing that his gain was always, in some measure, built upon another's loss. The entry that Rachel returned to most often was dated September 3rd, 1937. Arthur had been in Prague, staying in a hotel whose name he recorded with the specificity of someone who expected to remember details that others would forget. He had purchased a set of emeralds from a woman whose husband had been a diplomat, and whose estate was being dissolved because the political situation had made it impossible for the family to remain. Arthur wrote that the woman had placed the emeralds on the table between them with hands that did not shake, that she had described each stone's history with the composure of someone who had already grieved and was now conducting the business of survival. She had asked Arthur to take care of them, not to value them or profit from them, but to take care of them, as though the stones were living things that required attention and respect. Arthur had promised. And then he had brought them home and sealed them beneath a house on Birch Lane and trusted his brother to keep them safe. The promise had been kept for 87 years. The emeralds from Prague now sat in the underground room in a case lined with velvet that had faded from green to gray, their surfaces catching the climate-controlled light with a brilliance that time had not diminished. Rachel did not plan to sell them. Some promises, she believed, extended beyond the people who made them. The journal also revealed details about the construction of the underground room that deepened Rachel's appreciation for what Henry and Arthur had accomplished. The work had taken not 3 months, as Eleanor's letter had suggested, but closer to 5. Henry had excavated the space by hand, working at night to avoid notice, carrying the displaced earth to the ravine behind the property in buckets that he emptied and returned before dawn. Arthur had designed the shelving and the ventilation system, the latter being a network of narrow passages cut into the stone that connected to the surface through openings disguised as natural features of the landscape. These passages allowed air to circulate without permitting moisture to enter, creating the stable environment that had preserved the collection through nearly 9 decades of seasonal change. The brothers had worked in silence, communicating through gestures and written notes that they burned after reading. The secrecy was not paranoia, it was prudence. Arthur's collection had been assembled legally, but the legal frameworks of the countries from which many pieces originated were changing rapidly. Ownership that had been straightforward in 1925 was contested by 1935, and by 1938, so the concept of legitimate acquisition had been complicated by political upheaval to the point where possession itself could become a liability. Arthur understood that the safest place for his collection was not a bank vault, which could be opened by court order, or a safe deposit box, which could be seized during times of national emergency. The safest place was beneath a house that no one would think to search, in a room that no one would think to build. Rachel shared these details with her daughters gradually, adapting the story to their capacities for understanding. Lily received a version in which a brave uncle traveled the world, collecting beautiful things, and hid them under a house for safekeeping, like a dragon in a fairy tale, except the dragon was a person, and the cave was a basement. Lily found this entirely satisfactory, and asked if she could see the cave. Rachel took her down the stone steps on a Saturday morning, holding her hand, watching her daughter's face, as the flashlight, replaced now by proper lighting, but turned on ceremonially for the occasion, illuminated the shelves and their contents. Lily's eyes widened with the unfiltered wonder of a child encountering the extraordinary for the first time. She pointed at the ruby pendant and said it looked like a tiny sunset trapped in a necklace. Rachel picked her up and held her close, and thought that Lily's description was more accurate than any appraisal Martin Shale had ever written. Megan received the full story, unedited. Rachel sat with her in the kitchen on an evening when Lily was at a sleepover, and the house was quiet, and she read Eleanor's letter aloud from beginning to end. She showed Megan the journal. She explained the numbers, all of them, holding nothing back. Megan listened with an intensity that reminded Rachel of watching weather systems approach over open water, the kind of attention that preceded either calm acceptance or violent disruption. When Rachel finished, Megan was quiet for a long time. Then she asked a question that Rachel had not anticipated. She asked whether great-great-uncle Arthur had been happy. Rachel thought about it carefully before answering. She told Megan that she did not know. The journal revealed a man of extraordinary discipline and intelligence, a man who had traveled widely and seen much, and who had accumulated beauty in quantities that most people could not imagine. But the journal also revealed loneliness. Arthur had never married. He had no children. His closest relationship had been with his brother Henry, and even that relationship had been shaped by secrecy rather than openness. The collection had been his life's work, but a life's work was not the same as a life. The stones were beautiful, but they could not speak, or listen, or hold your hand when you were afraid. Megan considered this. She said that she thought the collection was both a treasure and a sadness, that it was amazing to have found it, but also sad that Arthur had spent his whole life alone with it. Rachel said she thought that was exactly right, and she said that part of the reason she had not sold the entire collection was because she felt a responsibility to the loneliness it represented, to honor the sacrifice Arthur had made by ensuring that the beauty he had gathered would eventually be shared with the world, rather than hidden from it. The conversation marked a shift in Megan's relationship to the discovery. She stopped asking questions designed to test the boundaries of the new reality and began asking questions designed to understand it. She wanted to know about the countries Arthur had visited. She wanted to know about the political upheaval that had driven families to sell their heirlooms. She wanted to know about the gemological science that distinguished a Kashmir sapphire from any other sapphire, and about the history of the Golconda mines, and about the woman in Prague who had asked Arthur to take care of her emeralds. The collection became, for Megan, not a source of wealth, but a source of education, from a window into a world that her textbooks touched only briefly, and that Arthur's journal described with the intimacy of someone who had walked through it with open eyes. Rachel encouraged this. She arranged for Megan to spend an afternoon with Martin Shale, who showed her how gemstones were evaluated, how light moved through crystal structures, how the geological forces that created diamonds differed from those that created rubies. Megan returned from the session with a notebook full of sketches and observations and a declaration that she wanted to study geology. Whether the interest would persist or fade as 12-year-old interests often did, Rachel could not predict. But the spark was real, and she recognized in it the same quality that had sustained Arthur through decades of solitary pursuit: the fascination with the hidden structures of the world, the desire to understand what lay beneath the surface. The anniversary of the discovery arrived without fanfare. Rachel did not mark it publicly. She did not host a celebration or issue a statement or acknowledge the date in any way that extended beyond the walls of the house on Birch Lane. Instead, she spent the evening in the kitchen with her daughters, eating a meal that Lily had helped prepare and that Megan had critiqued with the authority of someone who had recently watched 3 cooking shows and considered herself an expert. The conversation was ordinary, the kind that families have when the day's events are small and the kitchen is warm and the future, for once, is not a source of dread. After the girls went to bed, Rachel descended the stone steps to the underground room. And she had not been down in several weeks. The climate control hummed softly. The lights activated as she reached the bottom step, illuminating the shelves with a steady glow that was gentler than her phone's flashlight had been on that first night. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly, pausing at each shelf, not to inspect or catalog, but simply to be present with what was there. She stopped at the emeralds from Prague. The case sat on a middle shelf, unremarkable in appearance, its exterior giving no indication of what it held. She opened it and looked at the stones, 3 of them, deep green with a clarity that seemed to intensify the longer she looked. She thought about the woman who had placed them on a hotel table with steady hands and asked a stranger to take care of them. She thought about Arthur wrapping them in cloth and carrying them across an ocean. She thought about Henry lowering them into a room beneath a house that was not yet finished, trusting the earth to keep them safe. She thought about Eleanor knowing they were there and choosing not to look. And she thought about herself, standing in a bathroom at 10 o'clock at night, noticing that a mirror was crooked, pulling an envelope from behind it, reading a letter written by a woman who had loved her enough to trust her with a secret that had been kept for generations. The chain of events was so improbable that it resisted comprehension, and yet every link in the chain had been forged by a specific act of will. Arthur's decision to bring the collection home, Henry's decision to build the room, Eleanor's decision to write the letter, Rachel's decision to open it. Each one could have chosen differently. Each one could have broken the chain. None of them had. Rachel closed the case and placed it back on the shelf. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to the silence that surrounded her. It was a different silence from the one that had greeted her on the first night. That silence had been charged with mystery, with the electric potential of the unknown. This silence was companionable. It was the silence of a room that had fulfilled its purpose, that had kept its promise, that had waited patiently for 87 years, and had finally been found by the person it was meant for. She climbed the stairs back to the bathroom. The new mirror reflected her face in the light from the hallway, and she studied it for a moment, looking for changes. She looked the same, older, perhaps, in the way that years of hard work aged a person, not suddenly but steadily, like water wearing stone. But the expression was different. The tension that had lived behind her eyes for as long as she could remember had eased, replaced by something that she could only describe as presence. She was here. She was standing in a house that had tried to fall apart and had been rebuilt. She was raising 2 daughters who would never know the kind of fear that had shaped her own life. She was the custodian of a collection that represented the best of human ingenuity and the worst of human circumstances, and she was determined to be worthy of both. The weeks that followed the anniversary brought new developments that required the same careful attention Rachel had applied to every stage of the process. A museum in Washington expressed interest in displaying a selection of pieces from the collection as part of an exhibit on early 20th century gemstone trade. The proposal was detailed and respectful, offering conditions that prioritized the security and integrity of the pieces while providing access to scholars and the public. Rachel considered it carefully, discussed it with Patricia and Martin and Claire, and ultimately agreed to a loan of 6 pieces for a period of 18 months. The decision was significant, not because of the financial terms, which were modest, but because of what it represented. For the first time, pieces of the Arthur Calloway collection would be seen by people who had no connection to the family, no knowledge of the house on Birch Lane, but no awareness of the foreclosure notice or the water stain or the mirror that had hung crooked for 11 days before anyone noticed. The stones would be presented on their own terms, as objects of beauty and historical significance, and the story they told would be Arthur's story, the story of a man who gathered light from a darkening world and brought it home to be preserved. Rachel traveled to Washington for the exhibit opening, her first trip of more than 50 miles since the discovery. She left the girls with Angela, who had become a steady presence in their lives, visiting monthly and calling weekly and providing the kind of sisterly support that required no negotiation or qualification. The museum was larger than Rachel had imagined, so its halls echoing with the footsteps of visitors who moved through galleries with the hushed reverence that Americans reserved for institutions that housed their collective memory. The Calloway exhibit occupied a single room on the 3rd floor. It was small by museum standards, but it had been designed with the same care that Arthur had applied to his shelving and Henry had applied to his masonry. The 6 pieces were displayed in cases that controlled light and humidity with invisible precision. Beside each piece, a card described its origins, its composition, its journey from mine to market to the underground room on Birch Lane. Arthur's journal was displayed open to the entry about Prague, the handwriting visible behind glass, the words small and precise and patient. Rachel stood at the entrance to the room and watched strangers look at what her family had hidden. A woman in her 70s leaned close to the ruby pendant and whispered something to her companion that Rachel could not hear. A young man with a sketchbook sat on a bench and drew the Kashmir sapphires with quick, confident strokes. A group of students listened as their teacher explained the geological processes that created gemstones, using the Golconda diamonds as examples, and one student raised her hand and asked how long it took for a diamond to form. And the teacher said millions of years, and the student said that was longer than anything. Rachel smiled at that. It was longer than anything. Longer than the 87 years the collection had been hidden. Longer than the 100 years since Henry built the house. Longer than the centuries of human history that had produced the circumstances under which these particular stones had been cut and polished and traded and treasured and feared and finally brought to rest beneath a bathtub in a small town where no one expected to find anything of value. She spent an hour in the room before returning to the hotel. She did not introduce herself to the museum staff or the visitors. She did not identify herself as the owner. She simply stood and watched and listened, absorbing the experience of seeing Arthur's work through other people's eyes. The experience confirmed something she had felt since the first night, but had not been able to articulate until now. The collection was not hers to keep, it was hers to steward. The distinction was subtle but essential. Keeping implied possession, control, for the desire to hold and never release. Stewarding implied responsibility, care, the understanding that what she held had been entrusted to her for a purpose that extended beyond her own lifetime. On her last morning in Washington, before the flight home, she returned to the museum alone. The room was empty at that early hour. the galleries not yet filled with the steady stream of visitors who would arrive later. She stood before the ruby pendant, the same stone that Lily had called a tiny sunset trapped in a necklace, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the past year had been. The fear, the wonder, the disbelief that had gradually given way to acceptance. The loneliness of carrying a secret that could not be shared casually, so that changed the texture of every conversation because it existed in the background, whether she mentioned it or not. She had not spoken to anyone about the emotional cost of the discovery, not because she was unwilling, but because the language did not seem to exist. How did you describe the guilt of sudden wealth to people who associated guilt only with wrongdoing? How did you explain the grief of losing your identity as a struggling mother when that identity had been, for all its pain, the framework that gave your life meaning and direction? How did you tell people that you sometimes missed being poor, not the poverty itself, but the clarity it provided, the way it simplified decisions and eliminated ambiguity and made every small victory feel enormous? She had mentioned this once to Patricia, who had listened without judgment, and then said something that Rachel carried with her afterward. Patricia said that the transition from scarcity to abundance was one of the most poorly understood psychological experiences in human life, that it disrupted identity in ways that resembled grief, and that the fact that Rachel was feeling it meant she was processing the change honestly rather than hiding from it. Patricia also said that the feeling would not last forever, that eventually the new reality would become the reality, and that Rachel would build a new framework from the materials she had always possessed, which were intelligence and patience and the refusal to be anything other than herself. Rachel believed her, not because the words were comforting, which they were, but because the evidence supported them. Each month that passed brought a slightly firmer footing, a slightly clearer sense of who she was inside this new life. The woman who had cleaned houses and stocked shelves was not gone. She was the foundation upon which everything else was being built, just as Henry's masonry was the foundation upon which the underground room rested. You did not erase a foundation when you built upon it. You relied on it. You trusted it. You acknowledged that everything above depended on everything below. She returned to Birch Lane with a clarity that simplified every remaining decision. The collection would remain primarily intact, preserved and protected, available for exhibition and scholarly study, and the kind of slow, careful sale that maximized both financial return and historical impact. Individual pieces would be released into the world at intervals that respected the market and the stories each piece carried. The proceeds would fund the trust funds, the Anonymous Assistance Fund, and a new initiative that Rachel had been developing quietly for months. The initiative was a foundation dedicated to preserving and documenting the stories behind displaced art and artifacts. It would fund research into the provenance of objects separated from their owners during periods of upheaval, not to facilitate repatriation, which was a legal and political question beyond its scope, but to ensure that the human stories attached to these objects were recorded and remembered. Arthur's journal had taught Rachel that every beautiful thing carried a shadow, that the radiance of a gemstone was inseparable from the circumstances of its journey, and that honoring beauty required honoring truth. Angela became the Foundation's first executive director, a role she accepted with the same quiet determination that had brought her driving 3 hours to stand beside her sister in a bathroom on the night everything changed. Angela had spent years working in nonprofit administration, managing budgets that were too small and expectations that were too large, and the opportunity to lead an organization with genuine resources and a clear mission aligned with skills she had spent a career developing. The two sisters worked together with a fluency born of shared history and mutual trust, making decisions over phone calls that sometimes lasted hours and sometimes lasted 30 seconds, depending on the complexity of the question and the clarity of the answer. Their working relationship deepened the personal one. Angela had always been the sister who listened, who drove 3 hours without asking why, who showed up and stayed quiet and waited for Rachel to speak. Now she was also the sister who challenged, who questioned assumptions, who pushed back when she believed a decision was being made too quickly, or a risk was being underestimated. Rachel welcomed this. She had spent too many years making decisions alone, and the presence of someone who cared enough to disagree was itself a form of wealth that no appraiser could quantify. They argued once, seriously, about whether to sell a particular set of diamonds that a collector had offered to purchase at a price well above market value. Angela believed the offer should be accepted because the proceeds would fund 2 years of the foundation's operating budget. Rachel believed the diamonds should remain in the collection because their historical significance exceeded their monetary value. The argument lasted 3 days, conducted over phone calls and emails, and one face-to-face conversation in the kitchen on Birch Lane that ended with both sisters sitting in silence, neither willing to concede, neither willing to walk away. In the end, they compromised. One diamond was sold. The other was retained for the collection and designated for future exhibition. The compromise satisfied neither of them completely, which Patricia later told Rachel was the hallmark of a good negotiation. Rachel told Patricia that it felt more like the hallmark of having a sister, which Patricia, to an only child, said she would have to take on faith. Patricia drew up the charter. Martin Shale served on the advisory board. Claire Fontaine contributed her network of contacts in the art and gemstone worlds. The foundation was named not after Arthur or Eleanor or Rachel, but after the house itself, the Birch Lane Foundation. Because the house had been the constant, the keeper of secrets, the structure that had endured while everything around it shifted and settled and threatened to collapse. Rachel's life settled into a pattern that was both recognizable and new. She drove her daughters to school in a new car that she had chosen for safety rather than status, a decision that Megan noted with the dry observation that most people who could afford any car in the world did not choose a mid-size SUV in dark blue. Rachel told her that most people who could afford any car in the world had not spent years driving one with a rebuilt transmission and a prayer, and that reliability was a luxury she had earned the right to prioritize. Megan conceded the point with a smile that contained the seeds of understanding. She continued to contribute to the anonymous fund, expanding its scope to include educational grants for single parents pursuing vocational training and emergency childcare assistance for families in crisis. Each expansion was designed to address a specific vulnerability that Rachel had experienced herself, a gap in the safety net that she had fallen through, and that she was now, quietly and systematically, trying to close for others. She did not become a public figure. She did not accept interview requests or speaking invitations, or the numerous offers to tell her story in formats ranging from documentary films to motivational speaking tours. Patricia fielded these requests with the efficiency of someone who had learned that Rachel's privacy was not a negotiating position, but a principle. The story of the house on Birch Lane was told, inevitably, by others, in newspaper articles and online forums, and the kind of human interest segments that local television stations produced to fill the spaces between harder news. Rachel did not control these narratives, but she did not participate in them either. She let the story exist in the world the way the collection existed in the underground room, present but protected, available to those who sought it out, but not thrust upon those who did not. The relationship with her mother continued to evolve. Diane visited more frequently, drawn not by the money, but by the grandchildren whose lives had been transformed in ways she could see and measure. Lily showed her the underground room on one visit, leading her grandmother down the stone steps with the proprietary confidence of a child who had claimed a space as her own. Diane looked at the shelves and the cases and the stones that caught light and returned it multiplied, and she said quietly that Eleanor had always been full of surprises. Rachel, standing behind her, said yes. And then she said that the biggest surprise was not the collection, but the letter. The knowledge that Eleanor had trusted Rachel with something she had not trusted anyone else with, including her own daughter. The words hung in the air between them, and Diane nodded slowly, and the nod carried an acceptance that years of conversation had failed to produce. David's visits materialized with the inconsistency that characterized everything he did. He came twice in the first year after the discovery, spending weekends with the girls that were pleasant but shallow, the kind of visits that produced photographs suitable for social media, but not memories suitable for permanence. He did not ask about the collection directly, though his awareness of it was evident in the way his eyes moved through the renovated house, cataloging changes, calculating values. Rachel watched him without comment and allowed the girls to form their own assessments. Megan's assessment arrived during a car ride home from school, delivered with the casual precision of someone who had been thinking about it for weeks. She said that Dad was trying to be nice because of the money, and she thought that was sad, but not surprising. Rachel asked what made her think that. Megan said that Dad had never visited twice in 1 year before, and that the timing was obvious, and that she was not angry about it, because being angry required believing he could be different, and she had stopped believing that a while ago. The statement was delivered without drama, without tears, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a 13-year-old who had inherited her grandmother's talent for seeing things as they were rather than as she wished them to be. Rachel reached across the console and squeezed Megan's hand. She did not argue or defend or explain. She simply held on, and Megan held on back, and the car moved through streets that had not changed while everything inside it had. The second year after the discovery brought stability rather than drama. The foundation began its work, funding 3 research projects in its first year and publishing a report on displaced artifacts from the interwar period that received attention in academic circles. The museum exhibit was extended by 6 months due to public demand, and a traveling version was planned for 3 additional cities. The anonymous fund assisted 47 families in its second year of operation, each one a story that Rachel would never fully know, but that she carried in the same part of herself that had once carried the weight of her own financial desperation. Lily turned 9 and asked for a telescope for her birthday. Rachel bought her one and set it up in the backyard, and they spent an evening looking at stars that had been burning for millions of years, their light only now reaching the small yard behind a house on Birch Lane, where a mother and daughter sat together on grass that was green and trimmed and growing over soil that held no more secrets. Megan turned 13 and asked for nothing, which was itself a kind of gift. She had reached an age where wanting things had become complicated, where desire was tangled with awareness, and awareness was tangled with the knowledge that she could have almost anything, and that the having of almost anything did not automatically produce happiness. Rachel recognized the confusion because she had felt it herself, the disorientation of abundance after years of scarcity, and the strange grief that accompanied the loss of the struggle that had defined her identity for so long. She told Megan about it one evening, sitting on the rebuilt porch in the warm air of early summer. She told her that adjusting to wealth was harder than she had expected, not because wealth was burdensome, but because it removed the excuses she had used to explain her life. When she had been poor, every limitation had a cause. She could not travel because she could not afford it. She could not pursue education because she could not spare the time. She could not rest because rest was a luxury. Now that the limitations were gone, the choices that remained were entirely her own, and the responsibility of choosing was heavier than the weight of necessity had ever been. Well, Megan listened and said that she thought that was the most honest thing her mother had ever told her. Rachel said it probably was. and they sat together on the porch and watched the street settle into the quiet of evening. The same street where a foreclosure notice had once curled at the edges of a front door, its ink bleeding, its deadline approaching, its threat as real as anything Rachel had ever faced. The threat was gone now. The notice was gone. The ink had been recycled, the paper decomposed, the deadline rendered meaningless by the discovery that had arrived at the last possible moment, as though the house itself had understood what was at stake and had chosen that night, that hour, that angle of the crooked mirror, to reveal what it had been protecting for nearly a century. The neighborhood on Birch Lane had changed in ways that went beyond the renovation of Rachel's house. The contractors she had hired for her own property had been recommended to neighbors who had been putting off their own repairs, and the ripple effect of renewed investment had spread outward from her address, like rings from a stone dropped into still water. 2 families on the street undertook renovations that had been delayed for years. A vacant lot at the end of the block was purchased by the city and converted into a small park after Rachel's foundation made a quiet donation that covered the construction costs. The park was named after Eleanor Calloway, a decision Rachel had not requested, but had agreed to when the city council proposed it, while understanding that her grandmother would have found the honor both embarrassing and secretly pleasing. Linda Hargrove, whose transformation from critic to admirer had been one of the more visible consequences of the discovery, eventually became an unlikely ally. She volunteered at the nonprofit that administered Rachel's anonymous fund, processing applications and making phone calls with the same energy she had once applied to filing complaints. Rachel observed this change with the measured appreciation of someone who understood that people were capable of growth, and that growth, while it did not erase the past, deserved acknowledgement. She never mentioned the complaints. She never mentioned the cookies that had served as a vehicle for gossip. She simply treated Linda as a neighbor who had chosen to contribute, and the simplicity of that treatment seemed to matter more to Linda than any confrontation or recrimination could have. The school where Lily and Megan attended received a grant from the Birch Lane Foundation that funded a new science laboratory and a library expansion. The grant was anonymous, but the timing and the amount led to speculation that Rachel confirmed for no one. She attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony as a parent, standing in the back of the auditorium with the other mothers and fathers who had driven their children to school that morning, and she clapped when the principal thanked the unnamed donor whose generosity had made the improvements possible. Megan, sitting 3 rows ahead with her classmates, turned around and caught her mother's eye. The look that passed between them contained a conversation that didn't need words. They both knew, and knowing was enough. Rachel did not believe in destiny. She believed in choices, in the accumulated weight of decisions made by people who cared enough to act. Arthur had chosen to gather beauty. Henry had chosen to build a room. Eleanor had chosen to write a letter. And Rachel had chosen, on the last night before losing everything, to notice a mirror that was not hanging straight and to ask what lay behind it. Every choice in that chain had been made not out of certainty, but out of hope. Arthur hoped the collection would survive the coming storm. Henry hoped the room would hold. Eleanor hoped the letter would reach the right person at the right time. And Rachel had hoped, with the desperate, stubborn, irrational hope of a woman with $47 in her checking account and 2 daughters asleep down the hall, that something, anything, would change. Something had changed. Everything had changed. And the change had not come from outside. It had come from beneath, from the hidden spaces that the world had overlooked, from the patience of stones and the silence of women, and the endurance of a house that everyone had given up on, except the one person who could not afford to. The house on Birch Lane stood as it had for 100 years. Its walls were solid. Its roof was new. Its porch was rebuilt. Its steps firm. Its foundation repaired by contractors who had marveled at the quality of the original construction, and who had commented that whoever built this house had built it to last. They hadn't known how right they were. They had not known that the house had lasted not merely as a structure, but as a vessel, carrying within it a fortune that had waited patiently for the moment when waiting was no longer necessary. Rachel stood on the porch on an evening near the end of the second year and looked at the street she had known all her life. The oak trees in the backyard were taller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing them clearly for the first time, their branches reaching upward with the slow certainty of things that did not hurry because they didn't need to. The sky above them was deepening from blue to purple, and the first stars were appearing, faint and far and older than anything on earth. She thought about Eleanor's words. Be careful, be wise, be braver than I was. She had been careful. She had protected the collection and her family with the same fierce attention she had once applied to stretching $12 an hour across the demands of a life that cost more than she earned. She had been wise. She had chosen advisors and strategies and silences that preserved what mattered and released what did not. And she had been brave, braver than Eleanor perhaps, because she had opened the hatch and looked inside and allowed what she found to change not just her circumstances, but her understanding of who she was and what she was capable of. The mirror had been crooked for 11 days. The letter had been behind it for years. The collection had been beneath the floor for nearly a century. And Rachel Calloway, who had spent her life being told that the house was worthless and that she was foolish for holding on to it, had been the one to find them all. Not because she was lucky, not because she was special, but because she was there. Because she had stayed when everyone else had left, had held on when everyone else had let go, had noticed what no one else had thought to look for. That was the truth of it. The treasure was real, and the money was real, and the transformation was real. But beneath all of it, beneath the gemstones and the gold, and the numbers that still sometimes seemed too large to belong to her, was a simpler truth that Rachel understood better than anyone. The greatest treasure in the house on Birch Lane had never been hidden in the underground room. It had been hidden in plain sight, in the stubbornness of a woman who refused to give up on a house that everyone else had abandoned, or in the love of a grandmother who trusted her enough to write a letter and hide it behind a mirror, in the resilience of two daughters who had grown up watching their mother fight for a life that seemed determined to defeat her. The stones in the underground room were beautiful. They caught light and transformed it, and returned it multiplied. But they were not alive. They did not breathe, or laugh, or cry, or hold your hand, or sit with you on a porch at the end of a long day and tell you that everything was going to be okay. The people in Rachel's life were alive, and they were the treasure that no appraiser could value, and no auction could sell, and no amount of time could diminish. Eleanor had known this. That was why she had not opened the hatch, not out of fear, not out of indifference, but out of the understanding that some things were more important than wealth, and that the act of waiting for the right moment was itself a form of love. She had waited for Rachel because Rachel was the one who would need it most, and use it best, and understand that the true inheritance was not what lay beneath the floor, but what lived above it. The night was quiet. The house was warm. The girls were asleep. The stars turned slowly above the oak trees, and somewhere beneath the bathroom floor, behind a mirror that hung straight and true, a room full of beautiful things rested in the dark, waiting for nothing, needing nothing, existing simply because someone a long time ago had believed they were worth saving. Rachel Calloway believed that too. She believed it about the stones and the gold and the emeralds from Prague. And she believed it about the house on Birch Lane and the street it stood on and the community that surrounded it. And she believed it about herself, a woman who had been overlooked and underestimated and dismissed by everyone who had looked at her life and seen only what was broken. They had missed everything that mattered. She had not. And that made all the difference. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.